Okay, so let's begin the talk. So today, the title of the talk is Does consciousness come from the brain, and does it matter in regards to non-duality? Okay, does consciousness come from the brain, and does it matter in regards to non-duality? Yes, baby! So I think I was inspired to talk about this because I did an interview this week with a neuroscientist who's also a psychiatrist and really amazing person. It was a little intimidating, I have to say, doing the interview with him. He wasn't interviewing me, we were both being interviewed together. So it's like this neuroscientist and me. me. And just before I did the talk, the gentleman that was conducting the interview was like, yeah, they think he's just about to receive a Nobel Peace Prize. I'm so happy that he's going to receive this, but from my side I was like, okay. I sometimes wonder how I get myself into these situations, just because he's so intelligent and he's researched and thought and reflected on so many things. And I'm not saying that I haven't, but I just have a different brain. It's more like maybe a little less organized and like maybe more artistic or creative in a way, and not so scientific, even though I love science. Like I didn't even do my science GCSE. If you're English, you'll know what that is. So yeah, it was a little intimidating. But anyway, I found it really super inspirational and really exciting, because going in there, I was like, I'm not sure we're going to be able to meet in conversation. His name is Carl Friston. I think that's how you pronounce it. And he speaks really clearly and in depth about the subject that he's studied in, the subjects that he's studied in, the brain predominantly. But I wasn't sure if we would be able to communicate, because my language is so different from his. So I decided to go in talking about psychedelics, because I know that he'd researched psychedelics, and I decided to try and talk about the awakening and non-duality through psychedelics, and it kind of worked. We kind of had a really super beautiful conversation. I'm not even sure if it made sense to other people, but there was some sort of communication that to me happened on a deeper level. It was really beautiful. Yeah, it was really surprising as well. And both of us afterwards, I kind of said that was really lovely, but I don't know if it really worked for other people listening. But for us, there was kind of a communication that happened between these divides of science and non-duality. Yeah, it was beautiful. Anyway, so from a scientific perspective, the perspective would be that consciousness comes from the brain. And I don't know if I really care, to be honest, if it comes from the brain or if it doesn't, which is really surprising for a non-duality teacher to say, because predominantly, except in a lot of neo-Advaita traditions, predominantly in non-duality, the perspective is that everything is consciousness. And that is non-duality. So everything is consciousness. So the room is consciousness, the floor is consciousness, and consciousness is not produced from the brain. So therefore, when the body dies, consciousness does not die, it lives on. And that's like massive teaching in non-duality. So if then the scientists prove that consciousness comes from the brain, and it's a trickery of the brain, it's an evolutionary process that's arisen in the brain to help this species survive, then, you know, it kind of contradicts non-duality to the majority. But to me, I don't really care. Like, this world is non-dual, whether consciousness comes from the brain or whether it is in everything. Because even like at the end of the talk, when we were talking, I think he said, although I can't properly remember, that he said something like consciousness is an illusion. And I'm not opposed to consciousness also being an illusion, because whatever we speak about or think about or imagine is a construct of our imagination. So therefore, any idea that we have about consciousness or oneness or non-duality is an imagination. And even if the brain is producing consciousness, so there is consciousness here and there's consciousness from all different perspectives, and then there's sort of a world, and we are separate bodies that create this consciousness, it still doesn't preclude oneness or not two-ness, because to me, everything is not two, no matter whether consciousness comes from the brain or not. The great thing about the consciousness teaching is it really proves without a doubt in the person that we cannot be sure that this is a divided reality. Because when we come back to our experience of consciousness, everything is consciousness in the experience, not intellectually, not something that I can teach to you in a fancy manner with lots of fancy words, but experientially, everything is consciousness. I can't separate out things from consciousness. So it's not like my consciousness ends here and then the world begins there in the experience. It might be like that scientifically or mathematically. We cannot prove that or debate that. But in the experience, I don't know where my consciousness begins and the world ends, and I cannot ever know that. That's the great thing about consciousness teachings. But then when you have the awakening, and I've decided I'm going to stop trying to be sensitive about this. It's like, you're making an experience, and then it creates me seeking if you speak about the awakening. But I'm going to start just using awakening more regularly in this energetic shift. I'm such an empathetic robot that I try to be so sensitive to everybody that it hinders me speaking. So if you find that something I'm saying is detrimental to you, just ignore it. Just think, and ignore it. But I have to use these words in order to be able to communicate. So the consciousness teaching is great until there is this shift in perception and there is this awakening. And then you kind of come to, I don't know anything. I don't know anything. It could be a consciousness comes from the brain. It could be that everything is made up of consciousness, but I don't know. But what happens in that awakening is there is a movement to a freedom in experiencing that seems to be non-human. It seems to be beyond the realms of evolution, beyond the realms of me, subject and object, beyond the realms of my pleasure is the most important thing. There is something that happens in experiencing where there is a peace beyond all of that. And it doesn't really matter to me the ways we speak about it. If I'm really honest with you, I don't even care if this is talked about in the realms of traditional non-duality, or what we all know to be as non-duality or Advaita or Indian philosophy. It could also be come to through scientific deduction. It doesn't really matter. What seemingly happens in the awakening is the individual self undoes itself through investigation. But it's also got this element of what we call grace in it, because we don't really know how that happens, because that can happen, that the individual self can undo itself and it can lead to insanity and hell. It's not tested. We don't understand this. But something happens in the human that I have no doubt about, that I see and hear all the time, and I hear it described from so many different perspectives, even from a Christian perspective, is that there is an undoing of self. The self can no longer hold itself together. The illusory identity that believes that I am a separate identity that lives inside this brain, that is experiencing this world, and my world is real, and what I think is real undoes itself. It could be through psychedelics, it could be through science, it could be through just thinking, it could be through Christianity, the chakras, it could be through non-duality. There is an undoing of this belief that I am a separate entity inside this body. My world is real and happiness is dependent on pleasure. So my freedom is dependent on pleasure. This is the parameters, you all know what I mean, of what everybody believes. And that, to me, is what creates suffering in the human being, is this belief in this illusory self that is created to survive in this world. And belief that that is who you are. And that is who is experiencing. That consciousness belongs there. It doesn't matter if consciousness is in the brain or isn't in the brain, but one thing I can say for sure is that that person that we believe, that people believe themselves to be, isn't conscious. It is a mechanism that's playing on top of consciousness. So there is consciousness, there is a watching, an empty watching that is not a thing. It doesn't matter if that is the source of reality. Like when you have the awakening, that becomes irrelevant. It is that there is something that's watching the person. There is something that's experiencing the person. It's not sucked into the person. The person is a phenomena appearing through, more than likely, lots of things firing in the brain or the body and giving the appearance of this person, but there is a consciousness that's experiencing it. And that consciousness, so when we come back to experiencing, that consciousness cannot be separated out from everything that's experiencing. So in our experiencing is always non-dual. Whether or not it's true, we don't know, because thoughts are always changing and more than likely thoughts can never grip reality. But what we know from experiencing is consciousness is not separate from my words, not separate from the computer, not separate from the room. We cannot find this consciousness. We can find this illusory person that believes it's real and is always coming and going. Like the illusory person, the personal awareness is always coming and going. There is many times where there's no personal awareness, there's no person, but there is consciousness. Like watching a film is a good example. That's not freedom, but it's a good example of that person disappears, and it's most likely why we quite like watching films, is because the person can be quite burdensome, quite heavy. Excuse me sometimes with the inability to pronounce my words properly. It's because I am an alien from the planet Azizwa, and sometimes we have problems with our articulation. For those that don't know me and are new, I just have to say that is a joke, right? I don't really believe that, because I know that some spiritual groups do believe those types of things. I don't believe anything, so in the end, everything I say can be broken down, and everything's a possibility. I could be an alien, but that's really weird. Yeah. So this is fundamental to the teaching of this style of non-duality, is that consciousness is not bound to the person. So there can be a disappearing completely of the person, and there is still consciousness. There can seemingly be a disappearance of the whole entire body, and there is still consciousness. We don't know in the end what's actually happening, because we haven't looked under the microscope and studied lots of test tube people. But experientially, that can happen. So, and the separating out of this is important for this style of teaching non-duality, because it's what happens in the person is the deconstruction of everything you believe, and the fundamental belief of society is subject-object. I am and I exist. But what is this I am and I exist? That all disappears when we come back to this pure big consciousness. But this consciousness kind of also disappears when you really go for it, because the consciousness isn't separate from everything. So then therefore, what is everything? And then we could say that everything is not a thing. The illusory person is constantly creating a world of who it is, and looking to verify its existence by all things that appear out there. So it's constantly trying to find reasons why it's great, find reasons why it's a shithead. It doesn't really care actually if it's positive or negative. It just wants to confirm that it exists and try to grow that existence like a tree. Like everything, it's trying to grow and take up more space. The ego is like a tree. Please know that I am a messy teacher and I'm not very good at sticking to words. So sometimes I will call the ego personal awareness, and sometimes I will call it the character, all different types of things. I'm just like that. I change my words. I forget which words I've used before. And even if I try to train myself, I then forget I've trained myself. It's just the nature of this. So you've got to be slightly flexible when listening to me and not hold on too tightly to what I say, because next time I can come along and contradict it. And that is so beautiful, because that is a reflection of how we cannot grasp this in words, in life, in words. Everything we think and we believe in the end is a big question mark. There seems to be things that are more true than other things that appear more consistently in our reality, but in the end we don't know. So in this style of teaching non-duality, the freedom is the collapsing of this illusory self, and the idea is that as you question everything you believe, that begins to collapse. But it's not a sure and safe way. What we're talking about here is really wild and on the cusp of society. It has also got the possibility, which I recognize and give warning signs, to send people mad, because you can stay in the ego, but then you can stay in that personal awareness and not have this big awakening, but it can just kind of send that personal awareness, that sense of self, crazy, because it takes on all these new beliefs and then tries to find validation for those new beliefs out in the world and tries to recreate that out in the world, and it can't, because what is happening is the removal of these beliefs. So then it kind of sends this illusory self kind of crazy. It's like, so you can get, for example, you can get personality distortions of believing that you are not good enough to exist. So when you're in relationship with someone, you shrink and you become not good enough to exist. So you don't assert yourself because you feel afraid, because there's trauma, all different types of reasons. So then you could take this concept and try to make it greater validation that you are not good enough to exist, but you wouldn't really know this on the conscious level. It'll be like an unconscious functioning. So it's like, yeah, I don't exist. And then you use that as more confirmation that you don't exist. Where healing that idea that you're not good enough to exist in relationship would be to look at wants, what you want, who you think yourself to be, your unconscious belief systems, and kind of creating a more stable ego through understanding your attachment needs, the way you're relating to others, and then looking at what it is you want and what it is you don't want, particularly in relating to others. Whereas if that ego construct used this idea that nobody exists as another way to validate that they're not good enough to exist, which they wouldn't really know that they're doing, these are things that can send the person crazy. So don't come here, please, I'm saying this from the bottom of my heart, which is an abstract idea because we don't really know what that means, but it's kind of cute to say. It feels like it because it feels loving when I say it. Please don't come here believing that non-duality is the only answer and is going to free you. I can also see how non-duality could send people mad. They also say in spirituality, in Sufism, in different forms of no self-teaching, that the point is to go mad. it is in a way, but there can be unhealthy, destructive madness. And then there could be a madness which is freeing. Yeah. I say all of this because I hear non-duality being spoken about more and more on the internet, and I'm so happy about that. But I also see and work with people closely and see how it can also be destructive. That's not non-duality's fault, it's just the nature of thinking. The human being is so complex. It's so complex, and we don't understand the brain scientifically, and we don't understand how all of this is working. But it also has beautiful results for a certain amount of people. Yeah. This is, and that's who you are, is this. That's only what you ever could be, is what's happening. How could you ever be anything else? So you could say life itself. And this is love, not from an intellectual perspective, not from an idea of you trying to suck something in to become a bigger sense of personal self. I mean, it's love because it is. That's non-conceptual, that's experiential. Okay, I'm just gonna look on YouTube to see that everything is working okay. I'm getting older and my eyes are going. I have to put my beautiful glasses on when I'm reading from now on, which make me look like a female version of Clark Kent, I think. I mean, that's me putting it nicely, trying to suck in a good idea of the personality structure. So in the end, you know, what we are left with is just what's happening. Like, this is the freedom. And two good bits of advice that I would give on the human level is understand your personality structure. You can do that from reading and learning about non-duality. You can do that from the Indian traditions of Ayurveda, yoga, these different traditions. I'm beginning to go a bit weak in my words there. And also from Buddhism. Buddhism have great analysis of the mind in beautiful sutras. You can also understand the mind from Western psychology, neuroscience, and I'm a holistic person, so I would recommend, you know, getting a holistic perspective on the nature of the personal self. The reason that I think this is a wise thing to do is that it's a slippery thing. So non-duality is about unpicking all of the ideas that you have and coming back to the basis of what you are, what you're born with, like the birthright. But the problem with unpicking it is if you don't have a teacher that you really trust and that is available to work with you, then you can go off into all types of delusions. The mind is always, the personal self is always looking to exist. It always wants to grow and become bigger, not because it's bad, but because that's the nature of life. If you looked at the mind like an animal or like a species, its nature is to grow and to expand and to bring in more for itself, to constantly validate its existence in comparison to the outside world. That's what it wants to do. So when you're using non-duality and unpicking yourself, you can often go into lots of illusions. And non-duality, spirituality, the esoteric New Age movement has lots of fantastic ideas that you can take into yourself. Like predominantly, like the main teaching is that of non-duality is that you are God. but not God like we all imagine it. So you can imagine that's like a massive new idea to place on yourself, like I am God. It's very attractive to those that have a tendency towards narcissism, but that's not what it's meaning. It's not about becoming something. It's not about taking that on to become this new God that is holier and wiser and speaks only spiritual things, and everything is coming from God. Everything I say, every action I do is God, so therefore I don't even need to think ethically. So it's like that. This is the problem. Like, this is the nature of mind, is it wants to become bigger. And that isn't what non-duality is pointing to. Non-duality is pointing to that you are no thing and everything, or your consciousness is trying to take you back down to the basis of experiencing, which has always been here prior to your brain growing all these fantastical ideas. And that basis of experiencing is not two-ness. And that will fundamentally shift, that recognition, that awakening will fundamentally shift who you think yourself to be, and there'll be an energetic shift. The personality structure will then become easier, as long as you don't go into the negative mad side. So if you have the awakening on this side, the personality structure will become easier. When I was speaking to this neuroscientist, he was kind of saying it can even out the grooves, it can rearrange the firing of the brain, so the firing in these deep ideas, it can make them lighter. So, and I would say that from my experience and from many other people's experience that I've heard, is it makes the personality structure easier, more see-through. But the fundamental thing is the real realization, without a doubt, that experientially this is not two, that there is something prior to who you think yourself to be on the human level. And that is unknowable. You could say that's an idea like that, but it's an experiential thing. It's not a thought about thing. It's accessing a place which is non-human. It's not invested in the human. It's not about the human becoming. It's stripping away everything. And then from that, there is a crumbling in yourself, and then there can be this expansion. So the shift from looking from a person to looking from this bigger place, this expanded place, and then the person arises in that. So when personal awareness or the sense of self is needed, it comes and then it goes. And then the person doesn't get so stuck in its ideas and trapped in what it believes itself to be. You know, a lot of people are walking around this planet believing that they're a separate identity, and most of the time I'm a separate identity that isn't good enough. Or the opposite, which is still, they believe themselves not good enough, but they project it into the opposite and then go, I am better than others. And both of those have suffering in them, like a lot of pain in them. And then there's all the free will and the idea that it's your fault or their fault, or all these ideas of what you have to be. And when there is this shift, all of this becomes very see-through. It's seen to just be thoughts. It's seen to not be the nature of your reality. Prior to that, that is the nature of your reality. Oh, I can take off my glasses when I'm just speaking. So I was talking about healthy things to do is to have a good perspective on who you are, so a good understanding on who you are on the character level, and then simultaneously moving your attention back to the present moment. So also doing emotional relief exercises, you know, like settling that person. You don't have to burn in all its pain, but like settling it down, so understanding it, settling it, becoming more rounded on the human level. And then also putting your attention into the present moment. Something magical can happen when that's being practiced. But you do all of that with also the very strong knowing that free will is also an idea which is illusory. So the idea that you are doing that and you are healing yourself to become something is also ideas that are firing, it's dreams that are appearing. It's like not letting yourself get stuck on anything. So these are the two things that I recommend as practices, but knowing that it's a description of what can happen, it's not a prescription, because who would I prescribe to? Who would be doing that? These are not more ideas. It's like the person, practice for me. Practice for me. I am better than them. It loves that, the mind. I have this. I have that. I have this. I have that. I am this. I am that. Ooh. That is me. Somebody said I'm like a kid's entertainer when I speak with all these squeaks and stuff. I'm sure it's pathology from childhood. That when I teach, I have to make myself like a child in order to not get machine gunned by the audience. I don't know ultimately why I do that, but could be a reason. It could be just the natural personality of the Cairns mechanism coming through. That would be unknown. But what is even a natural mechanism with the Cairns personality? That is just like boop. So right now, the tendency of the mind will to go into time. But you can also kind of like, maybe some of you resonate with another part of this entity, this stillness part. So when I'm speaking, there's also a stillness here. That sounds really grandiose, and that's another great thing that the ego would love to suck in. But I do notice it, when I speak to somebody that's totally lost in themselves, and then when I speak to somebody who's not so lost in themselves, so I'm implying that I'm not so lost in myself, there's a stillness that can be felt, like a relaxation. And maybe if you're more empathetic, got more mirror neurons, or maybe everybody can just sense that. But maybe it's not, maybe it's only more the empathetic and the mirror neurons and these types of things. So stillness can be recognized. So there's that can be happening, but you can also see as well how there is like this movement in time of a personality that's like wanting to hold on to things, like wanting to hold on to the future, the past, to get things, to avoid things. And it's all, like blip, 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 blip going. And then there is the ability to focus that. So it seems like there is ability to put that attention in the present moment. My friend Harold always says, put awareness in awareness. And then another friend who's autistic and tends to be a lot more practical, he's like, what the hell does that mean? A friend that's autistic can deal with, put it in the present moment, but put the attention in attention. Just notice the fighting of the mind to go off into thinking, into growing. It wants to grow, it wants to take things onto itself. And this isn't advisable for everybody, just to let you know. So you have to work out whether this is suitable for you, because for some people it can begin to become a battle all the time. For some people it can just be a bit of a battle sometimes. But sometimes it can be a battle and it's maybe not so healthy then, because you're producing a lot of stress in the body. I'm sorry, but I don't have a definite answer for everybody. There are many other teachers that do. I am not definite. Everything I say can be contradicted. That's like ammunition for my haters and gold nuggets for my lovers. I am openly saying I can be on one perspective wrong about everything, and I can be on one perspective right about anything, and I can be neither right nor wrong. Oh man. And that has been a very hard job for this body mechanism to come to terms with. The more I come to terms with that, I think the better speaker I'll become on one level, and the worse speaker I'll become on another level. The nature of life. And then it will be all colours in between. Yeah. Yeah. What to do? So when you're putting your attention into the present moment or into itself, notice, just notice, no big deal, that something knows this. So something knows that action. So isn't that interesting? Something is conscious of the personal awareness putting itself in itself. So what does that mean about the personal awareness? What does that mean? Just going to take a drink while you all try not to think about that too much. What does that mean? And what is that watching? And does that watching exist? If the watching cannot see itself but can only watch, does it actually inherently exist? And the great thing about this is that when we get to all this level, we don't need scientific research in this level, because this is a very personal thing. And this is about personally going within, which might not be within, because we don't know what within and what with outwards means, but we just say within, so we have some form of imagining of what I'm talking about. Like it's about the experience there, and something that is undisputable is that consciousness is not separate from that in which it's conscious of. And consciousness cannot be found as a thing, so therefore consciousness is all things and no things. And that's actually experiential. That's what's so beautiful about non-duality. I'm so in love with non-duality. On the human level, it saved my life. I'm also aware that in a parallel universe, it could have sent me insane. But for somehow in this particular reality, it sent me insane in a beautiful way. Like, it saved my life. would you like to see me as a child? I'm currently visiting my mother at the moment, and next to where I work, my mother has a picture of me when I think I was about 10, and I had my first dog, and I trained my first dog, and I came first and was in the newspaper with training my dog. Yeah, and it's just such a humbling picture. It's just so sweet. I just find it very sweet. So, have to get, you maybe can't see it. Yeah. Yeah, I went through most of my childhood being plumpy, and as a woman, even though that can be incredibly painful because society says that a pretty woman is slim, and there is a rejection of older women and women that are plumpy. There is a change that's happening, but it's still very ingrained, this idea of slimness. So as a child, I never grew up feeling attractive because I never got that reflected back. When I was really young maybe, but I never got that reflected back to me. You know, I got reflected back that I was a bit of a geek and weird and strange, you know, like I'm 10 years old, and I'm obsessed with dogs. My walls are just filled with dogs. I loved wearing clothes with dogs on them. It was just like an obsession. I loved teaching and training my dog. And, you know, I just was really not popular in any way. I wasn't bullied or stuff, but I was just a geek. I was just a nerd. And because I was plumpy as well, you know, it was like people just have this response to you like it's a weakness or something. So you're kind of pushed away. I'm not saying that's right in any way. But the great thing that it did was it never gave me an identity of seeing myself as attractive in any way, or as attractive to men or to people. Like it wasn't. Whereas if you're a young woman and you're attractive all through your childhood, you develop a way of behaving. Whereas I didn't have that to rely on because it wasn't there. And so I look at this girl, it also caused me pain. Like I remember like suffering about it, like really a lot of pain. Because people would bully you and say things. I was just so uninterested in that. But I was, you know, constantly being taught like that's so important. Yeah. See, we have so many different layers to this illusory identity. This is why it's great to have a well-rounded understanding, you know, with neuroscience, with psychology, with Advaita, with Indian spirituality, philosophy, to really get a perspective on what it is to be an illusory self, because it's so deceptive. You know, I came into the women's issues from a very young age because I wasn't what a woman should be. And so therefore, if you're not young, attractive, then people will reject you just on that. So then you have to resort to either being funny or to being an intellect, because it's like, where is your position in society? So I was brought into that very early, but a lot of people don't question that. I remember being at university and I was in a class, I was about 20 and this was 2000, and now there's a lot more perspective on it. But I remember saying back then that if Madonna wasn't slim and pretty, she wouldn't be popular. And it really upset everybody, and everybody was really angry with me for saying that. Now, there is a chance that's changing, and that if you produce really great music without that. But back then, I think that it was very difficult to be very successful if you didn't, as a woman, if you didn't fit into, in music, if you didn't fit into these categories. Unless you had like a really extraordinary voice, like Nina Simone or someone. Which I'm not sure that Madonna did, but she had some really creative ideas. And, you know, so there was a perspective here, and, you know, a lot of people just don't look at that perspective. You know, I meet 50-year-old women who are attractive all their life, and they've never really thought about the way people treat them. Like if you're an attractive woman walking down the street, it can create jealousy, but people will tend to be more friendly and trusting towards you. And also your own projections in this area, like your responses to people, your judgments. There's so much to the mind, you know, and all the places that it can go. It's so deep. And I recommend anyone that listens to me and just listens to me, don't. Go out and listen to lots of different teachers to get lots of different perspectives. Don't get stuck on one teacher. It can be good to have one person guiding you through things. Like I'm so glad that I had those 3 years with Roger. But even when I was with Roger, you know, I listened to all different types of teachers. And he always encouraged that because he did that as well. And it's like seeing it from all different angles, that no angle is the truth, because there is no truth, and that no one human could have all the answers. And why would that one human want to proclaim that they do? I mean, what sort of pathology is that? It's very attractive though, people like that. The more certain a teacher is, I notice, and the more radical they are in their certainness, attracts more people, because people find that safe. Whereas actually non-duality is about removing the beliefs. So having someone with really strong beliefs that you feel is safe is most probably building up the ego rather than dismantling it. I also recommend working with people one-on-one, but don't get stuck with just one person's perspective. You know, work with people one-on-one, but also read around. I mean, that can come from this mummy-daddy thing of like holding on to these ideas. It's fantastic taking a break, isn't it? Because look at me, it's like an hour and I've just been talking non-stop. Okay, so if there's anybody there that wants to ask a question, I will put on my reading glasses.